Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. This is Mike up here in Texas, and I've got another request by Shildsy through Buy Me a Coffee, and he says this is he says something that's not music related, Mike, but in this tutorial is two words being thrown around this era. Not meaning to bring your GM down, but just pointing out a banger from the past, the Holden 308 motor. Hope you enjoy, mate. Thank you, Shildsy, as always, for the continued support of this little bitty channel up here in Texas. Sorry, I'm jacking with this microphone. I had to do that so I could read that monitor. Yeah, so no offense taking Shildsy, you know, I mean, I have nothing to do with what vehicles people buy or don't buy, or, you know, none of that. I know y'all watch my GMC, my old truck videos, and yeah, man, you know, that's I don't know what we're getting into, but I'll discuss it in the middle sometime. All right, let's just get to it. See, I can't see anything with this microphone like this. All right, I still can't. Sorry, guys. You know, I reinvent the wheel every time I do this. So we got that up. All right, let's just get into this, shall we?
Its own Australian division, because they were too good at building V8s. GM executives made a phone call that killed Australia's most iconic V8 engine overnight. The Holden 308 wasn't just discontinued, it was effectively banned from reaching its full potential. What corporate secrets were they hiding, and why did this legendary Australian engine that could have rivaled America's best V8s get suddenly pulled from development? The answer involves boardroom politics you won't believe. How the 308 V8 became Holden's heart. In the late 1960s, Australia's automotive landscape was unique, isolated from global markets but fiercely independent. While American muscle cars were dominating stateside, Holden faced a dilemma. Sure, General Motors had plenty of V8 engines in their global portfolio, but bringing them down under wasn't as simple as loading them onto a ship. The truth is, Australia needed its own V8 not because of preference, but necessity. Import tariffs were brutal. Designed to protect local manufacturing, they made bringing in complete engines from Detroit financially suicidal. Shipping costs alone would have added a fortune to each car. This wasn't just about dollars, though. It revealed Holden's true position in the GM hierarchy. They weren't getting the blank check that Chevrolet enjoyed. When Holden engineers approached GM headquarters about developing their own V8, they were met with reluctant approval but minimal support. The Australian team was essentially told, "Fine, do it yourself, but don't expect much help." Working with roughly a quarter of the budget allocated to similar American projects, Holden's engineers began what many considered an impossible task. The result was the 308 cubic inch V8. Born out of necessity rather than luxury, it first appeared in the HT Holden series in 1969. What made this engine special wasn't just that it was Australian made, it was how cleverly designed it was under severe constraints. With limited funds, Holden's engineering team couldn't afford the latest manufacturing techniques or testing equipment. Instead, they relied on brilliant simplification. The block design eliminated unnecessary complexity, focusing on durability and ease of production. The engine used a thin wall casting technique that made it significantly lighter than its American cousins while maintaining structural integrity. A manufacturing triumph given the equipment available. This ingenuity extended to the cooling system. Australian conditions demanded better heat management than American engines typically provided. The 308 featured larger water jackets and improved flow dynamics that helped it handle the punishing outback heat without breaking a sweat. Then came the ultimate test. Mount Panorama, Peter Brock, a 308 powered Tirana. Victory at Bathurst. This wasn't just a race, it was national validation. The locally developed motor wasn't just competing with international ones, it was beating them on one of the world's most demanding circuits. This wasn't supposed to happen with an engine developed on a shoestring budget by a satellite division. As racing successes mounted, the 308 transcended its status as merely a mechanical component. For Australians, it became a symbol of local ingenuity triumphing against global corporate constraints. The distinct burble of a Holden V8 became part of the country's auditory landscape. When a 308-powered Holden cruised by, heads turned. It wasn't just a car, it was Australia on wheels. By the mid-1970s, the continuous development of the 308 was showing tremendous promise. Engineers had developed experimental versions with cross-flow heads that significantly boosted power while improving efficiency. Aluminum component testing suggested potential weight reductions that would have given the engine a power-to-weight ratio rivaling the best from Europe. The 308 wasn't just good for an Australian engine, it was on track to become world-class, period. The GM power play that silenced Holden. Just as the 308 was reaching its engineering apex, everything stopped dead, literally overnight. What happened to Holden's most promising project, and why would GM suddenly kill an engine that was winning races, selling cars, and making money? The answer lies in a single phone call from Detroit that rewrote Australian automotive history. On Monday, November 3rd, 1975, Holden's engineering team arrived at work to find their 308 development program completely shuttered. Security guards stood at the doors of the engine lab and test mules were being loaded onto trucks. The official explanation? Resource reallocation. But recently declassified GM internal memos tell a very different story. A confidential report dated October 29, 1975, from GM's North American Operations Committee contained a damning assessment. The Australian division's 308 cubic inch V8 development has exceeded performance parameters established for non-premium brand engines. In other words, Holden was getting too good at making V8s. What GM executives really feared was already happening in private testing. The advanced version of the 308, the one Holden engineers weren't allowed to talk about for decades, had been shipped to Michigan for evaluation. According to test sheets from GM's Milford Proving Grounds, the prototype Australian engine was producing 380 horsepower with emissions equipment that met upcoming standards. This put it dangerously close to Corvette territory. There will be no Australian V8 outperforming a Corvette, period, wrote John DeLorean in a scathing internal memo when he was still at GM. The hierarchy must be maintained regardless of technical merit. This hierarchy DeLorean mentioned wasn't just corporate politics, it was enshrined in GM's unwritten but rigidly enforced brand power structure. At the top sat Cadillac and Corvette. Below them, Pontiac's performance models and top-line Oldsmobiles. Chevrolet's muscle cars came next, followed by Buick. Holden, despite being GM's Australian crown jewel, was relegated to the bottom tier alongside Vauxhall and Opel. What's particularly damning is a transcript from the Global Powertrain Strategy session held in Detroit on October 30th, 1975. When Holden's chief engineer presented the cross-flow head 308 development timeline, the room fell silent. After his presentation, Chevrolet's engine director reportedly said, "You realize this can't continue, right?" Within hours, termination orders were drafted. The technical improvements specifically blocked by GM headquarters are staggering. The aluminum head program was completely scrapped despite successful testing. The electronic fuel injection system Holden engineers had adapted from Bosch technology, years before it appeared on American GM products, was shelved. Even basic upgrades like roller lifters were denied approval. When you compare what the 308 could have become to its American contemporaries, the picture gets even clearer. By the mid-70s, American V8s were strangled by emissions equipment. The once mighty Chevrolet 350 was down to just 165 horsepower in the Corvette. Meanwhile, Holden's 308 was already making 240 to 260 horsepower in race trim while meeting stricter Australian emissions standards. Had Holden been allowed to continue development, Australia might have led GM's global V8 technology instead of watching its homegrown engines slowly suffocate under corporate neglect. The 308 wasn't just capable of matching American V8s, it was poised to embarrass them. And that was something Detroit simply wouldn't allow.
All right, so I'll back that up 5 seconds. Yeah, so what I'm getting out of this is just corporate. It's not greed. It's almost like planting a flag. That to show that, by God, we're number one no matter what, regardless if you're going to be number one, regardless if we own you or not. Because I'm sure if they didn't own Holden, if GM didn't own Holden at that time, they would have just they would have just used their industrial might to blackball them, and they would have went under. So yeah, I don't agree. This whole world turns on money, and it's the rich get richer, and that'll be the way it is long after Mike is gone. We don't understand it, and you'll hear politicians, people that are, they're candidate for some office or whatever, and they'll say, we're going to stop the waste, let's stop the spending money, let's stop yada 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 yada, and then they get into office, at the White House. I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the United States, they get out at the they go in, their net worth is maybe $500,000, and they spend 4 years, 8 years, whatever it is, come out and they got $100 million, and they've only made a little over $100,000 a year. So how does that happen? It happens because of all this industrial money that is being thrown at them, and it changes folks. They say they ain't going to change. They're going to go in there and they're going to do a good job, but it never happens like that. They're going to go in there and they're going to do whatever is good for them, and whatever is good for the puppet masters, GM, for instance. We bailed them out during the 2008 crash or whatever. They came right up and asked the government for money, and the government gave them money. And the reason why is during all those years that they had their lobbyists taking these guys to lunch, putting them on a private airplane, whining and dining them, throwing money at their election campaigns, i.e. Their money laundering campaigns. And so, it's never going to end. It's sad that it happened, and I'm surprised this documentary was able to even see the light of day. How many? So it's been out for a month is all. So it may end up, getting, something happened to it. I don't know, but it's an interesting story. But it's not a surprise to me, and I'm ashamed sometimes of, what different countries do to other countries. We're better than y'all. That's the mentality. It's just crazy. Let's get back to it.
Was poised to embarrass them. And that was something Detroit simply wouldn't allow. Emissions, economics, and the end of an era. The corporate sabotage from Detroit was just the first nail in the 308's coffin, but what happened next ultimately sealed its fate. While GM executives were busy protecting their American V8s from Australian competition, global forces were converging to create the perfect storm that would make their interference almost irrelevant and reveal just how short-sighted their strategy truly was. Does this sound fair to you? Let me know in the comments. Should Holden have been allowed to challenge America's best?
Yeah.
The late 1970s brought a seismic shift in automotive regulations worldwide. The 1979 oil crisis sent fuel prices skyrocketing, while new emission standards were being implemented across major markets. Australia, always a bit behind the regulatory curve of Europe and America, suddenly found itself playing catch-up with stricter environmental regulations arriving in 1980. This should have been the moment for Holden's engineers to showcase their ingenuity. In fact, they had already developed several solutions to these challenges. The VH Commodore program included a remarkable 308 prototype featuring a microprocessor-controlled engine management system that reduced emissions by 35% while maintaining 302 horsepower, numbers that would have embarrassed many American offerings of the era. We had a working prototype with electronic fuel injection and exhaust gas recirculation that met the projected 1985 standards, explained former Holden engineer Craig Watson. But when we submitted the program for approval, we were told the budget had been redirected to global engine initiatives that would eventually replace our V8. These global initiatives meant that while Holden's engineers were fighting with one hand tied behind their back, GM was pumping over $500 million into V8 development programs for Chevrolet and Cadillac. For comparison, Holden's entire engineering budget for 1981 was just $24 million, less than 5% of what their American counterparts received. The economic reality in Australia made matters worse. The Australian dollar weakened substantially against major currencies throughout the early 1980s, making imported components increasingly expensive. This should have strengthened the case for continuing with locally developed engines, but GM headquarters saw it differently. Perhaps most frustrating was the lean burn combustion chamber design that Holden engineers had perfected for the 308. This innovation allowed for better fuel economy and emissions control without power sacrifice, but the technology was shelved in favor of purchasing emissions equipment from American suppliers, equipment designed for different engines with different characteristics. We were told to adapt American emissions systems to our engine, said former Holden calibration specialist James Connolly. It was like being handed parts for a Cessna and told to make them work in a helicopter. The systems weren't compatible with our combustion chamber design, our intake geometry, or our cooling system. We knew it would strangle the engine. By 1985, the writing was on the wall. Despite proving they could meet emission standards with their homegrown designs, Holden was directed to phase out the 308 in favor of imported engines. The final indignity came when the Buick-sourced 3.8-litre V6 and, later, the Chevrolet 5.7-litre V8 were chosen as replacements. Engines that cost more to import, required extensive modification for Australian conditions, and never achieved the same connection with local buyers. Many of these imported engines suffered from the very problems Holden's engineers had already solved. The Commodore VN's fuel-injected 5-litre 308 V8, the last hurrah for the engine, actually outperformed the first imported 5.7-litre Chevrolet engines in both economy and emissions testing, despite operating on a fraction of the development budget. So what happened to the Holden 308 wasn't just some historical footnote in Australian automotive history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when local engineering excellence collides with global corporate agendas. The 308's story perfectly maps the decline of Australia's entire car manufacturing industry. When you understand how GM systematically undermined their own Australian division's crown jewel engine, you can see the template they'd eventually use to dismantle the whole operation. The 308 could have evolved into something truly world-class. It wasn't technical limitations that killed it, but boardroom decisions made thousands of miles away by executives who prioritised American prestige over Australian innovation. Want more stories about the cars and engines that corporations tried to erase from history? Next time, we're exposing another car GM tried to erase. Subscribe so you don't miss it.
Yeah, man. I don't know what to say. It's corporate greed, like the narrator said. It's corporate greed. That's all it is. And American prestige over their Australian brothers down under. I'll never understand it. Y'all probably won't ever understand it. I was destined never to make any money other than just, a paycheck, go out, be a cop, go out, be a United States Marine, and come home and start all over again. I would be curious of why the engineers who developed the 308, the Holden 308, didn't branch out after that. After they found out that they had this technology figured out, why they didn't, just leave that company and start their own engine company and then offer that. And maybe they did. So I don't know, but I would think that they could have built that engine in their own factory and then offered that as a suitable replacement to the seemingly crappy engines that were coming in these new cars. So I don't know. More than likely, politics was involved in that too. Okay, y'all. That's going to do it for me. I know that was quite a long one, but Chilty, that was a good documentary. I had no clue about all that. But again, I'm not surprised, man. I'm not surprised at how these corporate I don't want to say bad words here, but these corporate weenies who've never driven a car, or they're not engineers. They're just, bean counters, can make these kinds of decisions. But that happens every day. Still does. All right, y'all. That's going to do it for me. So till I see y'all again, I'll catch you on down the road. And let's go to the outro. Be on the lookout for the next one, man. Bye, y'all.